This episode, I'm joined by Jacob Blumenfeld, who is a writer, translator, and philosopher based in Berlin. We discuss his book, All Things Are Nothing to Me, the unique philosophy of Max Stirner, alongside discussions on freedom, German idealism, egoism, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermitix or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. So Jacob Blumenfeld, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing the work of Max Stirner, but also your book, All Things Are Nothing to Me, the unique philosophy of Max Stirner. But before we jump into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what else you do other than write about Stirner.
Yeah, thank you. I live in Berlin and I teach philosophy here sometimes. I teach at FU. I teach on climate change, on ethics, on history of philosophy, on Hegel and German idealism. But I don't have a permanent job. I'm just kind of precarious, like everyone else. And I translate. So I'm a full-time translator from German to English. I translated a little book called Communism for Kids, which was fun to do a couple of years ago. I translate Rosa Luxemburg into English and a lot of different texts, kind of in the radical German tradition. Critical theory, Frankfurt School stuff. And I also write on theories of property, expropriation, housing, anarchist history, Marxist thought. So all these kind of different ideas.
Cool. Do you have a specific, should we say, ideological identification? Are you a communist?
Heretical one, I would say.
Okay. I think that's like the safe way.
Yeah, that's the safe one. Yeah. Not lowercase c or lowercase a, anarchist or lowercase c.
Okay.
But I've been part of like anarchist movements back in the past in the States. I'm from the States, and been engaged in different kind of collectives and struggles. So, but I'm very influenced by Marx and also anarchist tradition and kind of different readings of the left communist and kind of council communist theory, how that all kind of blends into kind of theories of collapse and decadence. Okay,
cool. I'm sure many of those things probably will come back in. But before we jump in with Stirner, I have to ask you the Hermitix question. So you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. We could include Stirner in the room and then add 3 more.
Oh, really? Okay, great.
Who would you pick?
So, Stirner, will probably be sitting down, like on the side, just watching, because when Stirner was alive, he would go to these meetings with these other young Hegelians, these other groups of free, and he would just like sit there and like smoke and talk, or smoke, and the others would talk, and then no one knew how crazy he was because he wouldn't talk that much, and then his book came out. So I imagine Stirner to just be smoking in the corner, and then what else? I think I'd like to have Rosa Luxemburg in there, who I've been translating recently. Brilliant thinker, revolutionary, insurrectionist. Rosa Luxemburg in there. I think Debord, sitting around. I want to know what he's thinking these days. And maybe in the middle, I would say either Du Bois or Frantz Fanon, because it's a good moment to grasp kind of what their view on the situation would be today. Let's say Fanon, Luxemburg, and Debord.
So, my understanding, I've read Debord's Society of the Spectacle. I've obviously read Stirner. I haven't read much Luxemburg at all. But I see a fair amount of connections there. Do you think there's anything that would come up where it would be very divisive between those thinkers?
Strategy, maybe, political strategy. They probably have a certain perspective of forms of domination that are present today, whether that's called capital or the state, that have kind of a similar idea of what's dominating them, and whether that's kind of creates more forms of alienation. But they would probably differ on political strategy, like how do you abolish their conditions of domination, your conditions of exploitation. And Rosa Luxemburg would kind of be more, I think, insurrectionist. Want to maybe based on like a militant party. Frantz Fanon would probably defend violence and like a national liberation struggle. De Board, yeah, I'm not really sure what he would advocate beyond kind of détournement. Stirner, insurrection, of course, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure these thinkers will come back in. It's an interesting room. It's pretty politically charged.
Yeah.
So, you don't want to step foot in there if you're a capitalist, I don't think.
Yeah.
So, onto your book, All Things Are Nothing to Me, published by Zero Books. When was this published?
The end of 2018.
Okay. So yeah, why did you write this? What drew you to Stirner so much that you wrote a book?
Yeah. I actually wrote the first draft of that book in 2009.
Wow.
And it didn't come out till about 10 years later. I revised it a lot in between. I was in grad school and I was interested, politically in anarchism, but I was also philosophically interested in kind of Hegel, Marx, kind of the German tradition. And I saw this figure, Stirner, kind of on the outskirts of anarchism and kind of somehow also in this German tradition. And then he was also getting reappropriated or rethought by some thinkers like Saul Newman and Andrew Koch. They were starting to read Stirner as kind of a post-structuralist at this point too. And I was reading them. They were reading him through kind of French lens, like inspired by Derrida, Deleuze, or Lacan. So I was interested in kind of rethinking Stirner in kind of his more German context a little bit more. So as a post-Hegelian and not just as kind of a post-structuralist. And then seeing and also taking seriously his work on, or his theory of property, of the self, of the nothing. I wanted to kind of reconstruct this theory instead of just kind of pointing to his critique of morality or his critique of humanism. I wanted to see if there's something there we could develop more. So I had fun with it. I tried to, reconstruct it, read it anew. And then I sat on it for a while. I thought maybe it was not interesting. But in the last couple of years, I noticed that more people were kind of making memes of Stirner. He was circulating on the web. So I decided maybe it's a good time to try to get this out into the world. And I revised it and then published it. Yeah, I revised it when I started seeing these kind of Stirner becoming more, popping up more in kind of memes and online. I thought maybe it makes it's a good point to put this out into the world so that there's more content here and not just kind of this random figure who keeps on saying the word spook.
Yeah, I was about to ask, do you think well, obviously then you think the memes are pretty reductionist.
Yeah, but I think they're funny. So, so I like them. But they're kind of just like this figure of this crazy man saying spook to everything, which can be used for any kind of content, kind of ideological vessel, which you can put in anything right or left or extreme or not. So I think it's fine. It's hilarious. But it would be nice to kind of give more content to what actually Stirner said. And you can't get that through a freaking meme. So.
No. Perhaps it's a good place to start because it's probably the question on everyone's minds. What is a spook?
What is a spook? Spook, yeah. I mean, it's a German word, right? Spook, it's like gespukt. It's like when you have something in your head that's kind of not really there. That's what Stirner meant. Stirner was trying to think about, how is it possible that we think thoughts that tend to dominate us, right? And he called these things spooks. You could think of this in a very reductionist way, in which this is like really just kind of some ideas out there that if we just stop thinking them, they go away. Like the idea of God or truth or justice or morality, ideas that are used to dominate groups of individuals to serve some kind of particular purpose. Or you can think of it in a more complex way, in which these are not just kind of ideas, but they're actually kind of ruling principles that structure institutions and ways of life. So I try to read it more in the latter way. And that's what a spook is. It's kind of a ruling principle, which is developed by human beings, but takes on a life of its own and begins to dominate us. That's a spook in a sense. And there's other words for this that become more technical.
Okay. Do you think that's why Stirner's taken on by, the entire political spectrum? Because this idea of a spook is actually fairly flexible. Seems to be quite flexible. Of
course, yeah. I mean, if you have no other political or kind of ethical content, then sure. Then you can call anything across the spectrum as a spook. but it's strange. I mean, because you have people defending Stirner, like Stirner's a bit like Nietzsche, right? It's hard to pin down. It's hard to say if he's consistent on certain points. You have people defending Stirner from kind of a pro-property perspective, like he's a big libertarian, or defending him from a more kind of anti-capitalist perspective, as if he's like the communist, which I kind of promote. I kind of reread him in that way. But I try to say that he wouldn't want to be, or his theory doesn't tend to be. It cannot be supported by any claim based in something like a fixed idea, like a nation. Like you can't use him to defend a nation, I would say, or a race, or like a certain racial perspective, or a gendered perspective. Anything that's kind of used to defend an identity. That's kind of what he's really against. Whether that identity is religious, national, racial, political, even, right? And since it's not political, man, it's open to everyone. Like he's even against politics, right? So, at the end of the day.
So, do you think there would be something missing or something wrong about someone who sort of used his philosophy to almost legitimize a personal nihilism?
No, it's not wrong. I mean, that's there. I think that's there. I mean, and I think that's where the struggle of the interpretation comes in. And then you need to take a perspective and say, okay, that's your perspective. It's a weak version of Stirner. I think it's there, right? But there are I think the more coherent perspective is a social version. Because Stirner, at the end of his book, like the last 100 pages, is about intercourse, which is the German word for like interaction, like solidarity, unions of individuals coming together to interact and to enjoy each other, right? And to enjoy life, and to create their own kind of values together. And that's, I think, more where Stirner's ending up. It's kind of proactive way of life, of forming new lifestyles together. So you could stop at kind of the nihilist part of it, which is fine, which is just kind of the critical. But that would be, I think, only to go halfway.
So because this is the common understanding, I would say, of Stirner. It's when you see the memes, when you see people sort of utilizing him, it's almost like a justification of, well, that's just a spook. That's just a spook. And anything that comes in is just a spook. Now, perhaps I'm repeating myself, but there must be more to it than that. You mentioned insurrection. But what other sort of cornerstones to Stirnerian philosophy would you say there are? Because that seems to be the basis, and to move from that basis is quite difficult because, of course, that's a constant sort of removal of anything that gets posited.
Yeah.
So is there any sense of creation or building within Stirner's philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, this is the paradox, right? How do you move beyond just critique, right? Right? Because every time you posit something that you want to defend, well, it could be subject to the same criticism. Oh, aren't you just kind of defending something new, like an ego, right? When that was Marx's critique, right? Marx and Engels were saying, oh, you're just positing a new spook, which is the ego itself. And Stirner actually responded to this and say, actually, he doesn't care about the ego in a sense, right? He's talking about himself and what it means to be I, to speak from a subjective first person perspective. So I think we need to start with what is Stirner responding to and see where that gets us. And Stirner is responding to kind of a social order which is dominated by certain kind of ideas and principles that are said to be universal, but are used to serve particular purposes. So some of these ideas are God, church, the state, justice, even like humanity. We're doing this for the sake of humanity. That's why you should, get in line and go to work. You should be productive. You should be good. And he like this is 50 years before Nietzsche, or 40 years before Nietzsche is writing these things. Stirner is trying to say, actually, all these values that are being used to get people to work, to be good citizens, to be functional, to be happy. These are just ways of kind of siphoning off or exploiting ourselves as concrete, as concrete individuals, exploiting us for another group of concrete individuals. I think that's kind of a powerful move to say, okay, let's break out of these abstractions that are used to kind of talk about what's actually happening, which is the concrete exploitation or domination of some group of people by another group of people. And this is also kind of rise of industrial capitalism, in which it's getting harder to see who is dominating who, right? Because we're ruled by all these abstractions like money, right? Who rules money? Right? What is an economy? How do we fight? Who rules the economy, right? What is the state? What is a modern state? Not a feudal state with a king, but a modern republic, which is supposedly ruled by the people. So Stirner's trying to theorize, like criticizing these new forms of domination that are harder to see, that are self-produced, produced by human beings, but are done in the names of some groups of people over others. And so he wants to get back to what he calls I. Everything that's considered kind of bad from the perspective of the ruling class, which is, egoism, individualism, consumerism. He says, actually, fuck it. I'm an egoist. I want to start from what I believe, from myself, from my needs. And I think that's his turn. That's his kind of reversal. And maybe that seems more common today because now we have kind of a history of critiques of alienation and reification, which he's kind of starting to theorize. But from that starting point, who am I? What are my desires? What do I want? What's dominating me? Then can we start to build up kind of real human real positive, enjoyable kind of relations with other people based on recognizing them as also singular individuals. And from there, he starts to build up kind of a theory of society, I would say, a theory of intercourse, a theory of joy, of pleasure, of interaction, that, does have some positive content there, but it's not kind of fully fleshed out. It's more open. And I give kind of this quasi, communistic reading of Stirner, which is, of course, controversial because I say in the end of the day, he's talking about communes or unions of these egos coming together to interact and enjoy and violate each other to kind of, to not just set up a new state, but to kind of overthrow the state without setting up a new ruling principle, and to do so in a way that, can always be, you could always exit from. So, you could see as quasi-anarchist, kind of small-scale communistic. And other people can read him in more kind of libertarian ways. And he's talking about the free market, but I think that's a bit. I don't think that really works at the end of the day.
In what sense does he move away from the language in the sense that the language and signification is something that holds us? Because obviously you mentioned, we were beholden to these values, good, to be good, to be a citizen, whatever a citizen means. These are signifiers which we all understand in a collective sense, whether or not we have a sort of nuanced view. We all understand, like, in a subjective way, what it is to be a good person.
Yeah. In
what way does he move away from that almost as like an analytical proposition that we're all just beholden to these signifiers?
Yeah, it's one thing to name it, to call it out. Be like, oh, actually, what are these values that are, what are the value of these values, as like Nietzsche would say. It's another to try to move beyond it. And this is where it gets tricky, because you could read it in a way in which Stirner is saying that the way to get beyond the value of, let's say, what he calls like humanity, which is this new word that the critical critics are using, like Bauer. They're using this word human being, of humanity, to criticize religion, which is kind of a form of domination of this moment in which people are categorized by their religious beliefs, and the church actually is a form of power. And opposed to this power, people are saying, no, we're all humans. We're all human beings. And as human beings, we should, form a human community and form a political community based on just our humanness. And Stirner says, well, actually, maybe this is just placing up a new principle, which can exclude certain people who don't appear human, right? Who don't fit the categories. And I think this is kind of a far understanding. Even with the idea of human rights, we tend to think that human rights are universal, but they actually, there are a lot of people who don't have the right to rights, who are left out of this category, who are just seen as less than human. And Stirner's already grasping at this. And on the one hand, he says, to challenge this, we really need to kind of think our way out of it. We need to use different language. Of course, any language we use is always going to be somehow influenced by those who are, or by the language we grew up in. kind of by the traditions. That's why his language, he says it comes out confused. He tries to use sarcasm and play and allegory to kind of show us the contingency of our words. And at the end of the day, it's almost nominalist. He wants to so far get away from abstractions that he tends to just say, we can't even talk about what's real, which is I. But I think at the end, he wants to say, no, we can talk about it. We just have to realize when we're talking about these things, we're not positing new universal principles that are valid ahistorically forever. So I'm talking about me, you're talking about you. We can even talk about human beings and truth and the good, but we have to recognize that we're staking a claim, and we're saying this is what I want, that's what you want, and we can kind of slowly agree together on certain new ways of organizing our lives. But that would be kind of a different way of coming to terms with these words and this language than just adopting them and trying to be a better one or a worse one. So instead of saying I'm a good or a bad citizen, why don't we reclaim or posit a different word that we can fill the content with in the way we want?
So in the sense of Hegelian dialectic, it's the synthesis begins from the individual, from the ego, as opposed to sort of as an event.
Well, there's a lot of technical terms in there, yeah. I don't know if there's a synthesis in Stirner at all. I don't even know if it's adequate to call dialectics what he's doing.
Okay.
I would say he's a reader of Hegel, he's a student of Hegel. I try to say in the book that he begins where the phenomenology of spirit ends. So in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, it ends with absolute knowing, in which the subject realizes that they're not separate from the object that they're conceptualizing, but there's kind of a unity between subject and object. And that unity requires understanding our history and our time and our culture and language itself as both a product and a presupposition of our consciousness. So we could really begin from our first person perspective, but without being separated from our environment. And Stirner's like, yes, I. Let's start with the I, or the particular I, and let's kind of try to reshape the world around us from this perspective, instead of giving up our power to some authority, whether that authority is the academics, the philosophers, the state, the religion, to speak for us. So he posits this I, this revolutionary principle. Not an abstract I, like Fichte does, but a particular I. And this is seen as what he calls egoistic, because how can you, what's the value in this I? Where do you get, how can you build up society from an I? Sounds crazy. Sounds too particular, subjective. And I think, okay, well, I think, for instance, Marx and Engels, they didn't think it was subjective. They thought that this was actually interesting. They thought that maybe we need to start with ourselves. Start with, what am I lacking? What do I want? What do I need? And from there, you could appeal to or you could create an alternative way of life, instead of saying we're fighting for justice or truth or the good or humanity itself. So this kind of, I read it as this beginning from this concrete individuals, as Stirner says, and starting from there to rethink our needs and our desires. And he doesn't have the end, though. He doesn't say where does it go, except for some kind of vague union of egos and insurrection. But his starting point is revolutionary.
Okay. Is that what you state? He's the perfect candidate for absolute negation?
Yeah, because he doesn't want anything. He doesn't want to be identified with anything. He said our I, what we call our subjective, our first person perspective, constantly we fill it in with categories, with new categories, whether it's like nationality or racial categories or our ideological categories, identity categories. And there's a term that Adorno uses, which is a non-identity. Adorno writes about non-identity as kind of a way in which the subject and the object is never kind of identical itself. And Stirner somehow says, yes, we every attempt to identify this I with a name, with a proper value, a proper name, can be resisted and moved against. And that idea of like constant negation of our properties, which he calls properties or attributes or qualities, that which wants to define ourselves. Mm-hmm. That absolute negativity is the I. I mean, that's subjectivity in a sense. That's what it means to be a self, to be able to consume and reject all the identifications that we go through. So I'm not just a parent or man. I could also reject these categories and change them. But even though they're a part of me, I'm not just a worker. I'm not just a philosopher, whatever I think I am. Even though I can these properties I can adopt, but I don't want to be just a human, whatever that means.
Does Stirner state is there a process to this negation, like how we perform this rejection in a way?
I try to trace out a process in the book, in All Things or Nothing to Me. I try to show this kind of process of taking what's alien to us and making it our own again. It's what he calls ownness, Eigenheit, where we own our qualities, we own our properties. And I say I call it expropriation, right? It's a way of reclaiming property that seems, property is kind of a broad term here for attributes, qualities, those things that identify us. By expropriating them, by claiming them as our own, and abandoning them. So rejecting them, destroying that which we identify with, is a way of claiming ownership of it. So in a sense, this doesn't necessarily have to be like a literal, right? But it can be literal. So rejecting my qualities as being identified as a worker in a sense, by striking, let's say, or by giving up, or by being a bad worker, is a way of showing my ownership over this attribute, in the sense that I'm not defined by it, but I define it. I have power over it. Mm-hmm. So I read this as kind of a practical ethics, in a sense, right? So it's a practical way of orienting oneself to the world, so that they can show that they have somehow a power over those qualities that we tend to think are independent of us. Of course, in the end, you can't do this alone, I think. This requires more people, requires more power, what he calls power. But that's a way of showing one's ownership to the object by being able to reject it. And this is also a classic attribute of property rights. So in a standard theory of property rights, you have the right to possess, sell. You also have the right to destroy. Mm-hmm. In like kind of liberal property theory. So if I have this like tissues over here, I can rip it. I can destroy it. That's my right. Mm-hmm. And I think Stirner says, okay, yeah, we can also kind of destroy all these qualities and attributes of us. And that also shows that we are, in a sense, owners of it. And right doesn't give us that. Law doesn't give us that. Our power gives us that.
Okay. And that's where, one of the interesting things which sort of surprised me about your book is sort of the first third is an overview of Stirner's the first two sections are overview of Stirner's philosophy, and then it goes to part 3, which is your Stirner, or in the book, my Stirner. Yep. And you begin a lot of practical views of Stirner. And one of the ones that really interests me is that I thought, well, how is he going to pull this off? Is you read Stirner through the lens of Stoics, through Aurelius and Seneca. Yeah. I wondered if you could expand on this, because I think for anyone with a sort of my sort of understanding of Stirner is obviously fairly amateur, and I don't really think it takes too much to understand the Stoics, but my understanding of them both is that's a real, almost like hardline opposition in terms of philosophy. That, there is no one who is more beholden to values in an extremely disciplined, practical way than the Stoics. So in what sense can you, I just think this is probably the best example of the way in which you sort of utilize Stirner's philosophy in a practical sense. So how can you, how can these two things work together?
Yeah, great. Thanks for pointing that out. I'm great that you found that, because I haven't been asked about that. So I actually had another section on the Stoics, which I cut because I just thought it was getting too weird. I'm on Epictetus.
Oh, I wanted more. I think maybe it's because I've been reading I actually had been reading Epictetus. Discourses recently, and I thought...
So you knew it. Okay, yeah. So I had a section on Stirner. I was like, it doesn't make any sense. I have to cut it. So I got this idea actually from Foucault, who says this in his Hermitix of the Subject, that he wants to read Stirner and kind of some 19th century anarchist philosophy in relationship to the Stoics, because they're all doing somehow an aesthetics of the self.
Mm-hmm.
What Foucault calls an aesthetics of the self, a way of understanding kind of the self-presentation in the world, a care for the self, a logic of the self. And he traced this 19th century tendency in Baudelaire, in Stirner and Schopenhauer. It's kind of reflection on the self back to the Stoics, who also had this kind of like kind of Greek understanding of self-discipline, right? Focusing on the self and training the self into the world to know what is up to them and what is not up to them, what can be changed and what cannot be changed. And it's highly disciplined, you're right, with exercises, breathing exercises, physical exercises that can train one to deal with hostility and enmity in a way that can neutralize. I mean, first of all, like Stirner is seen as kind of the anti-Stoic on first appearance because he's, hedonistic, anything goes, no rules, pure pleasure, pure consumption, pure joy. That would be the opposite of Stoicism, which is seen as controlled, unemotional, and disciplined. I said, okay, well, actually, one way of reading Stirner is as a way of understanding oneself. It's a way of treating oneself, as a way of disciplining oneself to confront the things that dominate them. The kinds of structures or principles or ideas that tend to keep one fixed. That means not able to develop their own potential, to pursue who they really want to be, who they really are. And this is what Stoics, in a sense, are also trying to do when they say, okay, we need to distinguish between that which is up to us and that which is not up to us. And we need ways of cultivating a sense of self that can withstand external forms of external conflict or external objects, and ways that we could also deal with our internal forms of control or internal forms of pain and suffering, and change those. So how do we change the forms of suffering that are up to us, and how do we accept the ones that are not up to us? I think Stirner has a theory of property, right, which is what is up to us versus what's not up to us. And his way of thinking is to, in a sense, train the soul. Of course, he wouldn't use that word, but train the self, discipline the self to withstand these attempts to shape one's subjectivity into a principle that one does not identify with, or to alienate themselves. Now, this is a particular way of reading Stirner and the Stoics. There are other ways, but I thought there's something there to see Stirner as kind of a modern Stoic, and to also change the way we see Stoics, that they're not just these asocial, emotionalist aesthetics. They were trained and disciplined. They had schools, they had communities. It was a way of life in which the self was seen as kind of a work of art that should be sculpted and trained and disciplined. And Stirner's not so explicit on this, but it's in the sense of showing how we could think ourselves out of certain puzzles. He's getting closer to that.
Okay. Is there any other examples of the my Stirner section that you'd like to bring up that you think sort of might have been overlooked in terms of sort of Stirner scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was speculative, right? I was just trying to bring Stirner into contact with philosophers and just say what happens when do the sparks fly, and can we read Stirner in what happens when we read him in comparison with Heidegger? Heidegger has an idea of mindness, and Stirner has an idea of ownness. Are they the same thing? Are they different? I try to say that they're different. Heidegger's focus on being towards death. Stirner doesn't care about death. I liked reading Stirner next to Levinas, which kind of also makes no sense, since Levinas's whole philosophy is about ethics of the other person. How do I understand myself in relation to another? And Stirner's entire perspective is how do I understand myself from my own perspective? But I tried to say there's something there. They're both these both quasi-anarchic philosophers who try to say there's no principle determining the self. They don't want to be beholden to a totality, in Levinas's language. They also have they meet at certain points, and I thought that's kind of interesting. I liked reading also Stirner in relationship to Jewish mysticism. Landauer,
Mm-hmm.
who Landauer was influenced by Stirner at certain points in his life. And I'm not sure at this point he was, but there's a certain overlap of thinking. Landauer talks about, Landauer's an anarchist. And he says, don't kill others, only kill yourself. And what he means by that is, kill the cop in your head, kill the forms of violence that are dominating yourself, and try to change those structures and build from there. And he kind of wants to do all these. He's promoting almost more grassroots level projects to change society instead of taking and seizing power, and that seems very close to Stirner.
So what's Stirner's view on death?
Interesting. He talks about, in the beginning of his book, he talks about kind of the 3 cycles of life, or the 3 stages of life. He's following Hegel here.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about the child. It's kind of this proto-psychoanalytic understanding of the mind. He says the child is a realist. The child just sees what's around him and plays with the real objects. And then the teenager becomes, or the adult, or the teenager becomes more idealistic, wants to see the ideas behind things, the causes and the reasons. And Stirner hopes that the adult becomes an egoist, in his sense of the word, in which he's able to see, to stop looking for the causes behind things, and like the kid, enjoy them for what they are, but also relate them back to himself and see how what he's looking for is also a product of his own will. And then he says there's a 4th stage, which is like, death, old age and death. But he says when that comes, I'll get to that. So I think he doesn't. I don't think he has a theory of death. If anything, he doesn't see death as negative at all, which would put him close to the Epicureans, right? Epicurus, who also has kind of he's not worried about death. No, he said there's no fear of death because death doesn't exist. When we die, we don't experience it. We're gone.
So he wouldn't see death as a property. What about would he see?
No, because we can't own death, really, right?
We can own our conceptualization of death. We can still let it affect us, though. So that would be our subjective creation of the concept of death that we're allowing to affect us.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe we're dominated by a certain conception of death that says, death is the bridge to eternal life, or something like that, or this world is impermanent, the next world is permanent, and death is that transition. I think he would be critical of these ideas of kind of making a metaphysical conception of death as somehow all meaningful and determinative, and rather have a more playful conception of death. At the end of the day, though, we can't not die, not yet. So there would be a sense in which we are never completely owners of ourselves. And we can't fully own our conditions of existence. And I think, I'm not sure if he says that, but that's where I go in the book. Okay. There is a certain incompleteness to the self, right? We cannot own everything about us, and that's a good thing, I think. That's what it means to be ourself is also determined from the outside, and there's a certain acceptance of that in a way that can be integrated into one's self-conception and not just denied or repressed or tried to overcome through ideologies or religions.
Okay, I mean, I'd say this is a fairly big question. What perhaps nothing changes at all, but what do you think happens to the egoist outlook, the Stirnerian outlook, perspective of the subject within our contemporary sort of? I don't think anyone knows how to describe it, so I'll throw a few signifiers out there. Postmodern, neoliberal assemblage of various isms and things like that, which I would define as basically actually an alteration to how we perceive time, in that we're in a smaller and smaller present every day. And we live like, basically a tweet length existence. And I would say that this is a bit of a problem for like the egoist outlook, because it seems to me from my understanding that the egoist who's trying to relate properties back to the subject needs that deeper subjective understanding of culture, myth, history, events to draw back and forth between two to then understand the object or the ideology or the spook, right? So what happens in the current state that we're in, where our brains have basically sort of been fried into this just living in a tiny present where we actually where we're detached. We're detached from the future and the past.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, that's you nailed it. I mean, you can call it the spectacle which we live in, or you can call it, space-time compression. Capitalist. I mean, I just call it capitalism, but you can call it different phases of capitalism, neoliberalism, or whatever you want. But I think the tendency has been there, and it's just accelerating and accelerating. And there's a banal sense in which our present is egoistic or individualist, right? In the banal sense of that we are socialized to think of ourselves as consumers of products, and that we identify with certain products, and these products, choosing these products is the realm of freedom, and we have a right to these freedoms. And when we buy these things, we have property rights to them, and we can orient our entire lives according to certain different product choices. We can think of our careers as also as making ourselves into a product, right? We are the product. And, slowly all of our ties to bigger questions and bigger social groups become cut, and we are atomized. And that's kind of a contemporary form of egoism that has not really much to do with Stirner, but it gets confused with Stirner.
Okay.
Because for Stirner's not really thinking about this atomized, consumptive individual who just fixates on their goods, right? He would criticize this as another spook, as another form of what he calls addiction, right? We're addicted to our goods, our properties. If we can't destroy them, if we can't separate ourselves from them, then we're dominated by them.
Yeah, this is my question though. This, should we say like Stirner egoist, capital E, consumerist egoist, small e.
Yeah.
What happens if the small e egoist is so dominated that they don't even realize there is a possibility of sort of getting to that true egoism? They're just forever stuck.
Yeah, I mean, we have no time, right, to break the chains. If we can't see them because we have no time to understand the relationship between past, present, and future. So I think that Stirner would say, we can always break the chains, right? We can always, no matter who we are or when we are, everything comes from our ownness, from our negative particularity, from our nothing, right? There's nothing there that humans don't put on themselves, right? Everything that is ourselves, we have given to ourselves. I don't know how far that goes in terms of like natural sciences, but he goes pretty far, right? Every category we use, we can get rid of, and that goes all the way down. And at the core of us is kind of a creative power. We call it the creative nothing. And that's the power for us to redefine and redetermine who we are as a self, as an I. And I think he would say that's, in a sense, irrepressible forever, right? That can always reappear. I would say yes, but here's my kind of, my Stirner. To realize that, to take advantage of that, requires other people. We need other people to help us sometimes break out of repetitive routines of life, which we're captured in, which are dominating us, which we can't break free of without other people, without a union of egos, what he calls it, without solidarity, without a commune. And so I would say, yes, you need to socialize it or communize it, right? And then you need forms of action, forms of interaction, which can unify to break the forms of domination that keep us isolated from each other. And that arises in certain moments of uprising that happens, forms of critical thinking, forms of creativity, forms of art. I think there's political, aesthetic, and ethical moments in which this kind of repetitive spectacle society is temporarily pierced. And those are the moments that can be expanded into forms of unions or forms of communal ways of life that are never institutionalized for sure, but never also ultimately repressed.
Okay. Is there anything, sort of any misinterpretations that you want to draw on that we might have missed, or anything key that we might have missed that, maybe something that people always think that's Stirner, but it isn't, or something along those lines that sort of always irks you when people bring up Stirner?
What always irks me. People tend to read Stirner as someone who doesn't believe in kind of social relations, as if we're born. We're like people read him as a Hobbesian. We're born like life is brutal, nasty, and short. We're born alone. We die alone. We just fight for each other, and that's it. So the point is to just dominate and gain and just fight and gain as much power as possible. That's kind of a Hobbesian interpretation of Stirner, and I think that's not there at all. I think Stirner says we're born in society, we're thrown into society. All of our kind of conceptions of ourselves are social, and the trick is to try to reclaim or to break those social categorizations, those social identities, to break those forms of identification and reclaim them, redefine them, maybe readopt them, but for ourselves. From our own perspective, and we could do that as an I, as an ego, and with others. So I think he is kind of social from the start, and trying to break free of this kind of form of social domination, back to a sense of what do I genuinely want, what do I genuinely need, and then from there build up kind of a different social understanding. I think he's not like a libertarian really. People tend to think he's like just a believer in property rights. He says over and over again, he doesn't give a shit about right. There's no such thing as right that can give him a claim to the state doesn't give him authority over an object. His idea of property is way weirder, way more expansive. A theory of attributes, a theory of those objects around me, which define me, which I can use and discard for my own pleasure. So this is not a theory of property rights per se. Freedom is also not even a big category for him. He doesn't really care that much about freedom. I think
how come he doesn't care about freedom in the sort of common sense?
Yeah, in the common sense. I mean, maybe we could say he's got a deeper theory of freedom if we want, but in the common sense, he says over and over again, like, people talk about freedom, they always mean freedom from something, right? So they're freedom from some kind of master, freedom from some kind of control. And he says, this way of thinking, it ends up just always giving us a new master that we're always trying to get free from. And we're always trying to get free, and there's always a new one. It's always kind of repetitive. And what, at the end of the day, what is it that's always trying to get free? He wants to start from there.
In that sense, he doesn't seem like much of a negative thinker dare I say it, and just overly complicate everything. He seems almost like a Deleuzean in the sense that everything is positive. So it's like, it's not freedom from, which would be a negation, but it's actually freedom to not. So freedom for the subject to positively not do that
there
thing.
You go.
But that's not like in relation to a master-slave thing.
I think that's it. I mean, that's where like absolute negativity turns into positivity at a certain moment, right? Because he's really against this idea of negative freedom. Yeah, he thinks it's completely wrong. Read Bullock's. And there's like Deleuzean readings of Stirner, right? Deleuze also read Stirner and commented on him a little bit. But yeah, there was this idea that we need to kind of own ourselves, right? There's a common saying in English, own up, own this. And not in the sense of buy it, right? But own it means to kind of take responsibility right? and claim it as yours. And that means take responsibility, understand it, deal with it, incorporate it into yourself, but maybe move beyond it without kind of disavowing it. So that's all there in Stirner, and that's a different way of understanding his kind of his words, his language, which are caught in this 19th century jargon, which is hard to see beyond. That said, I think it's important to read Stirner in kind of his German context as opposed to Galilean, which is not really done much anymore because it's not seen as like sexy enough. But I think it's productive to read Stirner in relationship to Hegel, to Marx, to Nietzsche, to Schopenhauer, and see them all as kind of struggling with these similar ideas of value. What is the value of values? What is truth? What is good? What is the grounding of our society when religion plays no role anymore? When the states are just kind of sovereign from the people. So I like to read him in that context, kind of this radical thinker in this moment, trying to understand what are the new forms of alienation that are being created in kind of modern capitalism. How do we define ourselves in opposition to it or not? And Stirner's also fun. I mean, he's a funny thinker. He's shouldn't be taken too seriously all the time. That's why he's not kind of adopted in philosophical circles as much, because his language is a bit too sarcastic, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, yeah. I mean, I did sort of want to mention this, that I originally read the Unique and Its Property. Is that the original title? Yeah. No. The Ego on Its Own is that original translation from from 1920s, which is like, as soon as I read is it the Wolfie Landstreicher translation? The Unique and Its Property. I've never seen a translation where the differences are so glaring.
Huge, right?
Like, ridiculous. Like, it's almost like a different book. So, like, anyone listening, it's really difficult to get a paperback version of that. But you can probably find a PDF of get the Wolfie Landstreicher translation, because it just fundamentally changes the book.
Yeah, The Unique and Its Property. Yeah, I have the translation. It's great. It's great version. And he did a service, 100 years after the first English translation. And I would say, read Stirner, have fun with it, read it from multiple perspectives, and then, see how it works, and, go from there. So right now I'm really interested in like theories of property and expropriation, which Stirner talked about a bit, and understanding what does it mean to expropriate, to reclaim or to dispossess or disown or retake property without right. So I think there's a lot there to go with Stirner, both kind of in terms of like philosophy, but also politics and ethics.
So are you working on anything else at the moment? Have you got a book coming out or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm writing some text on expropriation as kind of a political tactic. I have some articles on that, and I could send you some links. I write for this New York magazine once in a while called Brooklyn Rail, and if you just Google my name, Brooklyn Rail, my name, I have articles there every year, every couple months, on kind of culture, politics, art, philosophy. I've been thinking about climate change and trying to understand what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be a self in a warming world? Do we need to rechange our categories of time, metaphysics, politics, ethics? I did a dissertation, but I haven't published it yet, on the question of property, the meaning of property in German philosophy. That'll be out hopefully in a year or two. It's a bigger, more academic book on what does it mean to say mine. What is mine? It's there in Stirner, but I went really deep.
Who else are you sort of drawing from in that?
I draw on Hegel a lot. I draw on Kant, and I draw on Fichte. So, and then I look at contemporary stuff too. But those are the big three Germans, right up to Stirner. So right before Stirner and Marx. Who are these German idealists? What were they thinking about, and why were they obsessed with this question of mine?
No Schopenhauer?
I don't get to Schopenhauer. No, I don't get there.
It's a shame.
Next book.
Okay.
That's it.
Oh, cool, man. I think that's a good place to finish up. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.